like to give Sarah Glenn an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about MINSA and how you can join the society. Sarah, you can share your screen with us, please.
Hi, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Make it a little bit bigger. Yeah, so I'm Sarah Glenn. I am sort of the liaison between Bridge the Gap and MINSA. So I just wanted to speak to you for a few minutes just to introduce you to what MINSA is and how you can join. So MINSA, as Bhavisha mentioned, is the Mineralogical Association of South Africa. And it is a specialist division of the Geological Society of South Africa, and it's also affiliated with the International Mineralogical Association. So we've got some big local and international partners. So all of that can come into play when you're a member, so that gives you access to talks by MINSA members. And we also invite speakers for events like our AGM or end of year functions. And that covers a wide range of topics. We also do excursions. So some of the ones in the past have been to like a ceramics factory or to a analytical laboratory. So again, a wide variety. And then we also do workshops and symposia that are organized either by us or our partners. So for example, the GeoSkills course offered by the GSSA, or last year we did an online symposium on analytical techniques. And then we also have a quarterly newsletter. It's called the Geode, and each issue's got a special theme around it. And then it also covers general society news. So all of that gives you lots of networking opportunities. So if you are interested in becoming a member, student membership is free, but we do ask that when you email us that you include a short motivation on why joining MINSA is of interest to you, and then we will waive the fee that we normally charge our members. So to get the membership form, you can just email the address there, minsa@gssa.org.za, and request the form. You can then fill that in using your details, ideally not your institutional address. It's just so if you graduate, then we can still keep in contact with you. So once you fill that in, then you can return it again by email. And then in the form, you will also see that there is a proposer and a seconder. You don't have to worry about that because the committee will either form, there'll be two people on the committee basically that will be the proposer or the seconder. So we'll complete that on your behalf. So that's more or less it. These are just some of the things that we've done in the last year or so. If you are interested, you can, it just gives you an idea of some of the range of things that we cover. Yeah, so that's a little bit about MINSA.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Some of those networking opportunities and excursions sound really interesting. So I'm looking forward to some of them that will be taking place this year. And just to reiterate what Sarah said, if you're interested in joining MINSA, please feel free to contact MINSA, Sarah, or myself, BTG, and we will direct you accordingly. So let us move on to our speaker of this evening. So I'd like to introduce Igor Tonžetić. I hope I pronounced that correctly, but please correct me if I didn't. Igor has been the principal consulting mineralogist for 2 entities and has previously worked in Brisbane, Australia and Johannesburg, South Africa. His specialities involve the operation of semi-automated instrumentation where he has worked on at least 10 different commodity types and has trained in 19 different companies in 8 countries over a course of 15 years. He has also worked as a consulting technical specialist on 8 different international business trips to Brazil, India, England, South Africa, and New Zealand. He has authored over 125 technical reports and presented at 18 international conferences and has 25 publications to his name. He is currently a fellow of the GSSA and the third-time chair of the Mineralogical Association of South Africa. And he is also currently pursuing a postgraduate degree at the University of Witwatersrand, and he is a lecturer at UP. So I'm sure he has a lot to share with us. Igor, you can please take over. Please share your screen with us. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, Bhavisha. You didn't have to say all of that. Much obliged. I do have a lot to say, so I'm hoping I can get all of this in the odd 20 minutes that you've given me, but I'll do my damnedest to do that. And I guess we can get cracking. So I'm going to go into presenter view. Is that okay?
Yes, you can.
Okay. And I'm going to turn off my video because there's honestly not much you can see there. So
Sure.
Let's just turn that off. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. I was a bit surprised to find that this is the inaugural presentation of this Accelerate Your Career as a Mineralogist. Very happy that it's coming from MINSA's side and very happy that Sarah's running with this idea. I think it's very important. I would, excuse me, yeah, this is about accelerating your career, but my alternate title for this talk is the marketability of the modern Mzansi mineralogist, because I have a bit of a thing about alliteration. And get us into this whole idea about what exactly a mineralogist is or what constitutes a mineralogist. There is a mathematical way in which we can look at it, actually. You might not be aware of that, but for instance, if we formulate what a geologist is, and let's give that the geologist the variable G, and let's say that their office hours or their exploration hours are time T, and the number of those geologists we can represent by the usual N. If we're going to write an equation for this, of course, what we need to do is we need to include a bush factor, and we need to include the number of rocks that these geologists collect out in the field. So if we have a situation where N is an infinity, or the geologists increase, then we can construct this equation. And this equation, we use the bush factor as a factorization, as a variable that we multiply with Euler's number, because Euler's number has a compounding effect, right? So the more geologists you get together, the more, nonsense they're going to cause, and the more of a party there's going to be. And we have to, of course, raise that to the exponent of 2, and we have to collect the rocks. We will get some kind of a statement, B multiplied by Euler's number squared multiplied by R will eventually get us beer. And that's archetypically what a geologist does at the best of times, or a lot of the time when they're out in the field. How does that differ from a mineralogist? Well, we can do the same kind of a game, excuse me, where we can assign M as the variable for mineralogist. Once again, we have office hours, which we can assign T. Number of mineralogists is the same, N, but we need to put in a work factor because mineralogists often work from an office. So it's no longer a bush factor. If we then put that into this limiting equation, provided that N tends towards infinity, we multiply the work factor with the number of mineralogists. Once again, we have Euler's number, but we need to add an irrational number, which is the square root of -1. We'll give it to the physicists from Big Bang Theory who always complain about how weird geologists are, or Sheldon. And we get this, excuse me, this formulation of W multiplied by N multiplied by E multiplied by I, which we can then rearrange, and that gets us Y. So that's a tongue-in-cheek look at the differences between mineralogists and geologists. It's not as far-fetched as you might otherwise believe. But the other main difference is that mineralogists tend to dress just a little bit better than geologists. But enough of that tongue-in-cheek stuff aside, where do mineralogists fit into this whole story? And this discussion, I'm mostly going to come from an industry sort of perspective. I'll try and squeeze in the university stuff, maybe especially towards the end. But we're all, as geologists, familiar with sedimentary rocks, metamorphic rocks, igneous rocks, and how each of these rocks tend to be the speciality of certain domains. The experts who then specialize in sedimentary rocks are sedimentologists, metamorphic rocks, metamorphic petrologists, igneous rocks, igneous petrologists. And we might try and subtly nuance those differences. You know, if we talk about cataclastic rocks, which are between the sedimentary and the metamorphic, okay, we might say that the structural geologists will look at that, pyroclastic rocks, volcanologists, etc. But suffice it to say that each of these rocks, whilst a mineralogist might not specialize in any given rock type, we know that quartz, for instance, occurs in all of them. And the mineralogist will specialize in the minerals per se. So they'll know a lot about quartz, but almost nothing about sedimentology, igneous petrology, metamorphic petrology. And that is, you know, slightly nuanced description of a mineralogist, but I feel like we can do a little bit better than that, especially if we start looking at industry. And because South Africa is a very mineral resource country, this typically is the paradigm that we see mineralogists fitting into in South Africa within a mining context. So what you might find is that, for instance, an exploration geologist will go out into the Congo. He'll come across a green rock. He won't necessarily know whether that green rock is malachite or chlorite. He might then send it to a mineralogist to analyze, to make sure that it is malachite, for instance. And if it is malachite, well, you have a deposit which can be mined. After this deposit starts getting mined, a mining geologist will, make sure that only that green rock is being extracted out of the deposit. He'll send it through. He'll then tell the mining engineer, listen, you need to extract that green rock all the time. Mining engineer will extract it, give it to the mineralogist as a process measure or a process control measure. Mineralogist will once again make sure that that malachite is in fact malachite. And he will tell the metallurgist what it is that he needs to do to be able to process that malachite. Is the malachite bulk? Is there a lot of it? Does he need to mill the samples finer to separate malachite from other gang rubbish constituents that he doesn't want in the processing plant or whatever? And then once again, the metallurgist can give the mineralogist samples for process control, and the cycle can begin again. Now, yes, this suggests that a mineralogist can basically fit into this entire mining schema, but typically what we find is that the mineralogist will liaise far more with the metallurgist than any of these other situations. And it also goes, this situation also, okay, no, let me carry on with this then. So as a mineralogist, especially within industry, you might have started out as a foundation. You'll know a lot about the minerals per se, hematite, magnetite, all of that kind of jazz. But that's not enough to apply this in an industrial context. Invariably, what you'll find is that you will focus on, you will need to know something about metallurgy to process these samples. The processing will be very important. You'll need to know that magnetite has is magnetic, so you can separate it through magnetic concentration. Hematite is very dense media float separation. Chalcopyrite tends to float in a flotation cell. You'll need to know that kind of stuff for your knowledge to be applicable in a mining context. But you will need to know a little bit more. You'll need to know something about the chemistry, for instance. So what are the effects going to be of trace elements within your minerals that are going to all of a sudden get exposed in a smelter? Are those then going to affect the bricks in your smelting? Is that going to destroy the integrity of your smelter? So you need to know something about that. And of course, what tends to happen is that mineralogists have to be able to analyze those samples and be sure that the malachite that they're looking at is malachite or whatever. So they need instruments that can do that. And typically with the mineralogists, those techniques will be forms of microscopy, forms of spectroscopy, a whole bunch of things like that. So they'll need to know something about physics. And that will basically give you applied mineralogy. But once again, I feel we can do better than that, because this is a very limited definition of what a mineralogist, or more specifically an applied mineralogist, could do. Because what we could do is, in fact, the field of metallurgy can be replaced by a whole bunch of different fields. It can be replaced with environmental geography or anything like that. So for instance, if we know a lot about pyrite and chalcopyrite in the Wits goldfield, we know that depending on the chemistry and the fluids that are going through the Witwatersrand supergroup, we might find that we need to understand something about the chemistry, the ion exchanges that are happening within that process that is resulting in that water becoming acidic, which is then further eroding through faults and folds and causing a whole bunch of, mini earthquakes and all that kind of jazz. And then once again, of course, we'll need to know something about the physics of our instruments that we're using to analyze these guys. So the metallurgy field, this applied mineralogy idea, can be applied to any number of fields. And this is going to be a common theme in this discussion, because we need to appreciate and we need to step away from this idea that mineralogy is just mineralogy. Mineralogy is a fundamental science. Because it is a fundamental science, we can apply it to any number of other sciences out there that deal with minerals, whether they deal with them directly or indirectly. So we can do a little bit better than this definition of mineralogists, whether they're in industry or whether they're in research at a university. With regards to the physics behind all of these instruments that we deal with typically, and it is typically the mineralogists that deal with them. So any one of these major mining houses will have these instruments, and typically the person who operates those instruments is a mineralogist. But what's important for you to understand is that all of these microscopy instruments are analogs. They're all analogous to one another. And the reason why that's the case is because of this beautiful wavelength equation called the de Broglie wavelength equation. I personally feel much more sophisticated than Einstein's equation. But it says that lambda equals h divided by p, where lambda is the wavelength of a quanta, h is Planck's constant, and p is the momentum, which is the mass times the velocity of the traveling body, or quanta. And what you need to take away from this is that that quanta can be absolutely anything. It is not restricted to electrons. It's not restricted to photons. It's not restricted to ions. It's not restricted to molecules. In principle, if I had a beam of tennis balls and I threw them at a wall, provided I could get those tennis balls to hit the wall at the same place all the time, i.e. focusing those tennis balls, and provided I had enough of those tennis balls, I can derive information from the wall that I'm hitting with those tennis balls. I could do the same with an infinite amount of moons or human bodies or anything. So quanta is not restricted to this idea of a quantum realm, anything small. In principle, it can be massive. And here's just a further expression of that. So a lot of you would have been exposed to light microscopy. In principle, light microscopy isn't actually that different to scanning electron microscopy. There are little nuances and sophistications that happen with the scanning electron microscopy, but it's not that different. Both of them have sources. Both of them need to focus the beam. as a mineralogist, you need to understand the physics behind focusing a beam of light and a beam of electrons, because electrons are electrostatic and they cannot be transmitted through lenses, or at least through normal glass lenses that you use for light microscopes. So there we need to manipulate the electron beam with a magnetic lens that has an aperture inside, but we can still focus it and we can still manipulate it. We can still bombard a sample with electrons, and we can still derive information from that sample with those electrons. And it will be slightly different to the information that we'll derive from a normal light microscope. But fundamentally, these are the same based on that de Broglie's wavelength equation. The only other nuanced difference is the positioning, for instance, of some of these, the parts of these microscopes. So for instance, in a light microscope, the lens is your eye. I mean, the detector is your eye, effectively, which is placed directly above the sample. Usually in a scanning electron microscope, because of chamber geometries and the parts that go with these scanning electron microscopes, the detectors will be off to the side, and that's going to have physics implications. Now, obviously, you don't have to know about all of this physics before you get into the instruments. It comes as you learn the instrument. But eventually, as a mineralogist, you will have a very solid grounding in physics and all those other stuff on the side, which is going to help you as a mineralogist to do your job. This is just another expression of de Broglie's wavelength equation. We're all familiar with the electromagnetic spectrum. We know that we can use X-rays, visible light, to look at things under a microscope. De Broglie's wavelength equation expands this further because it says that, well, wait a second, we can actually use ions, protons, electrons. We can use ions in focused ion beam instruments, protons and proton-induced X-ray emission, electrons in scanning electron microscopes. And there's a whole host. All of this ties back together, and de Broglie's wavelength equation ties that in quite nicely. What we need to be aware of is that depending on the size and the mass of that quanta that we're using, we could destroy our sample more or less, but we could also penetrate through our sample more or less, and that's going to give us slightly different and nuanced analyses that we can get from that sample. So that's what we need to appreciate. But fundamentally, all of these techniques are the same. And of course, this is basically a glorified expression of our sense of sight, which begs the question, of course, can we get a glorified expression of our sense of touch, for instance? And yes, we can. That's called atomic force microscopy, where we're effectively touching a sample with a small needle, and we can then resolve actual atoms by using that. And it begs the question, could we someday use something that can electrically detect the taste of salt to differentiate salt from quartz? Well, people have already started looking into that, but that's enough of that. Once again, the analogies are here. We have what you would have referred or heard of diaphaneity with regards to light, how light is transmitted through a microscope, how it's reflected, how it's refracted, all that kind of jazz. And we have terms for that: opaque, metallic, translucent, transparent, whatever. But the same diaphaneity occurs in all of these other instruments. We just refer to it as beam volume interactions. And once again, it's important to note that the penetration depth of each of these different quanta is going to be different, and the amount of destruction that happens is going to be different. And it's also important to note that if we have different detectors to image what we're seeing and then to analyze what we're seeing, we might not be analyzing the same thing. And that's where the understanding of the physics comes into play, and that's why that's so important. But very much analogous one to another. If you can properly understand light microscopy, you are a long way towards understanding all of these other analytical techniques. But when you're analyzing these samples, then basically your first question is, are we looking at imaging, or are we looking at chemical analysis. Sorry?
I don't mind not.
Okay, are we looking at imaging or are we looking at chemical analysis, which is basically a dichotomous question of, are we interested in microscopy or spectroscopy? And you might have come across this and perhaps try to compare what you're doing between the two different techniques. A microscope is typically qualitative and we're looking at our sample qualitatively. A microprobe has a very strong chemical analysis component, and that's why it's called a microprobe. And to further this analogy, we can basically take all of these analytical techniques, and by asking 3 questions, we can put them all, or we can represent all of them on a Cartesian axis. The first question we ask is, what quanta are we using? And that's going to inform whether we want, what kind of chemical resolution we want, or what kind of spatial resolution we want if we're using these as microscopy techniques. The next question is, and this once again relates to de Broglie's formula, do we want to measure the chemistry of whatever it is that we're looking at, or do we want to measure its structure? And here, the type example would be a comparison between XRD and XRF. Both of them use X-ray photons to analyze a sample. The XRD simply is measuring structure though, and the XRF is measuring the chemistry. And once you've decided on whether your sample is, whether you want chemical analysis for your sample, you can then go about deciding which side of the de Broglie wavelength equation you actually want to use. Do you want to use your wavelength and take your energy for granted, i.e. use wavelength dispersive spectroscopy, or do you want to take your wavelength for granted and use energy and then use energy dispersive spectroscopy? And there are resolution implications between the two. But all of these questions can be applied to any analytical technique, basically, that is in existence, that mineralogists will use to get data from their sample. What kind of instruments do we have? I'm very much an Auto-SEM-EDS specialist. So here we have a QEMSCAN, here we have a mineral liberation analyzer, here we have a QEMSCAN newer technology, here we have a Mineralogic instrument, here we have a micro XRF. The thing about these instruments is that they are incredibly expensive. So if you're going into the entrepreneurship route, it might not be so easy for you to get 10 million Rand to buy any one of these instruments. The other thing to appreciate is that, each of these instruments were specifically designed and marketed for the mining industry. So for instance, QEMSCAN stands for quantitative evaluation of minerals through scanning electron microscopy. MLA means mineral liberation analyzer. Mineralogic, obviously, that refers to minerals. But that doesn't mean to say that you need exclusively use them for the analysis of minerals. If it is solid, it can be measured with these instruments. So that's a paradigm shift that you need to appreciate if you're going to get somewhere as a mineralogist. The other thing to appreciate about each of these instruments is that they are manufactured by multinational mega corporations. And just like what most multinational mega corporations do, just like Coca-Cola, is rather than being innovative, buy out smaller companies that have done all of that innovation and research for them. Now that comes with implications. That means that often, as a mineralogist, if you want to get these application specialists to change some software in the machine, it might not be easy to do. They might not be willing to give you an ear. So what independent mineralogists have started doing is that they've actually started programming their own software so that they can extract the information that they want from these instruments, rather than relying and waiting months, years, or whatever, rather than relying on these mega corporations who perhaps are lacking a little bit in their research and development to develop these ways in which you can extract that information. So my appeal to you is, if you want to become a mineralogist, that you seriously start considering and looking into doing some kind of a computer programming course, and Python is especially like that. I'll flip through these. because if you can pause them on the recording if you want to see what some of these articles are about. But this is from the director of Hippo Geoscience, Peter Buerta, and he's made an app. And I'm just going to read through this quickly, but he says that Picksal already contains an importer for QEMSCAN data, and we are working on developing importers for data from MLA, Mineralogic, AMICS, TEMA, Inca Mineral, and Nanomin. And you must appreciate that each one of these technologies is not manufactured from the same company. They are very different in terms of their, software and all of that kind of stuff. But here, you are empowering yourself with software that allows you to extract the data that you want from each of these analytical techniques and arguably apply it in another instrument or another system or whatever. So incredibly powerful. It is probably, and it is, we're actually there already. This is going to be the way to go for some of these instruments. That's quite important. With regards to entrepreneurship, I call this the SV model. But things are not necessarily too easy in South Africa right now, and you might want to consider an entrepreneurship model for being a successful mineralogist. How could you do that in an economic climate that is actually pretty difficult? What you can do, and I've seen this done, and I've done this myself, is that you can in fact swap your time and expertise for access to instrumentation so that you can then gain consulting work and experience, so that you can then swap for that. So there could be a company out there that has an analytical equipment like a SEM. You go to them and you ask them, I can give you some of my experience in return for me using your machine as my consulting machine. Excuse me. What are some of those things that you can then actually trade to get in there, to be able to use these instruments? Well, it could be any one of the following. It could be bug testing. These companies are always looking for beta testers to test the bugs in their system. It could be teaching the machine to actually recognize minerals or phases, because that needs specialist knowledge of minerals, which only mineralogists have. You could give customer demonstration. You could give customer training. You could write scientific papers for this corporation. You could write application notes, which is basically glorified marketing, but they need that to get knowledge of that instrument out there into the workplace, so that it can get sold eventually. Now, these are some of the companies that have done this before. I'm not suggesting that they will do this now or that they're in a position to do this now, but by all means, talk to some of the companies out there and give it a shot. Try it. With regards to actual career prospects, I did a survey a couple of years back. It was an international survey. I went on I went on Indeed.com. I researched the kind of positions that would either allow for a mineralogist to fill those positions or positions that explicitly asked for a mineralogist. And the first thing to see here is that the academia industry split was at about 70% industry, 30% academia. So as a mineralogist, chances are you're going to have to go into industry to actually get a job. It also means and suggests, and we've seen this, that not every university can employ 10 mineralogists. So that's a given. But the important thing to note and to see from this study is that of all of these positions, the most positions that a mineralogist could occupy went to something like as asbestos microscopy or as an asbestos microscopist. The only explicit position for a mineralogist was sitting at 1. And if you then take this into consideration and you didn't apply for all these other jobs as a mineralogist, if you applied as a mineralogist, then you might have been losing out on 24 career opportunities. So that's something to bear in mind. You need to be flexible with how you approach your conception of what it is to be a mineralogist. And a lot of these positions were microscopy positions, and lab technician, you might have to eat a bit of humble pie and just get some more experience before you can do that. But positions for mineralogists were very few. There were a lot of positions that mineralogists could apply for, though, and you need to bear that in mind. So you need to draw a distinction between this idea of a mineralogist as a form, excuse me, and a mineralogist as substance. For instance, you might call yourself a mineralogist. It might be your portfolio on your business card, but a mineralogist is so much more than that. A mineralogist will know something about technology. He or she will know something about chemistry. They'll know something about physics. They'll know something about microscopy, and they'll know a whole bunch of other things as well. And that is what you need to use to market yourself in the game. The pictures that I'm going to show you now are just a bunch of analytical stuff that I did previously, none of which was explicitly pure theoretical mineralogy. It was in different fields. So for instance, this is a micro XRF scan of the rock foundation of a bridge that collapsed. You build on rocks, rocks have minerals, minerals weather, and that's going to have implications for whatever excuse me, stuff you're building on top of those rocks. That's engineering geology that you can apply mineralogy to. You can apply mineralogy to environmental geology, which is getting huge, right? With all of this legislation that's going on, it's going to become very important. You can analyze dust filters, see if there's anything toxic within the dust filters or what kind of dust you're filtering out from any kind of a system. You can analyze asbestos in brake pads to see whether that's amenable to being, gotten into the air or whatever. Metallography. Here's an interesting one as well, because as a mineralogist, chances are you've made polished sections, you've made polished blocks. So you know something about sample preparation. And because you know something about sample preparation, you can have a very nice discussion with metallographers. You can prep the samples for them, talk about best ways to prep them, but you can analyze those samples as well. You can analyze, for instance, in this case, cut off chips of a cast iron engine block. And once again, do not restrict yourselves just because you're a mineralogist. Do not restrict yourself to this idea of, because I'm a mineralogist, I can only analyze minerals. I can analyze basically anything solid. And in certain instances, if you become a specialist in micro XRF, you could even analyze some liquids and get information from there. So to slowly get to an end, or quickly as it were, let's look at where mineralogy is in South Africa versus the world. Now, we are basically, in terms of mineralogist numbers, sort of official numbers, we're middle tier, which is okay. It's great. We could arguably do better or you'd expect better because we're a mineral resource rich country. The problem is, if we actually compare this, the number of mineralogists per population, we find we're actually low tier. And what's interesting about this graph, and this was a survey I did in 2019, where I asked all of the member organizations of the International Mineralogical Association whether they could give me their numbers. And then, of course, I compared them to population sizes. But what's interesting here is that the countries that have the most mineralogists per population size are the ones that tend to be resource poor. South Africa destroys these countries in terms of resources. Greece, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, Slovakia. We have more resources, and yet they have more mineralogists per population size. So just to read this graph, basically South Africa has one mineralogist per 400,000 people, whereas a country like Austria has, or let's take one that's close to a line, Denmark has one mineralogist per 100,000 people. So that is very interesting and very curious. And it might be that because we are resource rich, that's exactly what's limited our thinking to where we can apply mineralogy and how we can apply mineralogy as mineralogists. So last slide before the conclusion. I thought I'd mention just a couple of shortcomings or pitfalls that I've seen from the graduates over these last couple of years that I have been lecturing. The first is initiative. It seems to be a lack of initiative, and I think that might have been compounded because of COVID, and nobody really knows what's going on, and it's very difficult to know how you're supposed to approach these subjects now that they're all online and all the exams are online and everything. But you're going to need initiative to market yourself as a mineralogist. And that could be something as simple as going out there looking for presentations that you can give, or something like starting a Bridge the Gap chapter at the University of Pretoria or UJ or Poch or UFS, whatever. But that kind of initiative is going to help buffer your CV, and that's going to help get you an interview, and it's going to help get you a job. I see a lot of initiative being lacking. Intellect, I've purposefully chosen intellect here rather than intelligence, because intellect has a nuanced meaning of being able to problem solve. I don't see guys being strong with problem solving now to get those jobs. So try and solve these problems before going to your lecturers and your professors and your managers and all of these guys. And if you can train yourself to solve these problems at a university level, it's going to bode well for getting a job in industry. Independence, once again, a lot of mothering going on during COVID, but you need to be able to, before the question's asked of you, you need to be able to ask the question. So that's very much lacking. And then as a fusion of some of these things, if you can somehow cultivate initiative and independence, so go out there independently, look for places where you can present, suggest conferences or workshops, or write articles in local mineralogical association newsletters, or even amateur society newsletters, eventually you will get experience which will buffer your CV, which means you will get the interview, which means that you might get the job. Engineering, the more you expose yourself to these instruments that a mineralogist typically exposes themselves to, the more you'll appreciate that sometimes us as scientists, we're very theoretical, but we can't get stuff to work. Sometimes the engineers are not very theoretical, but they get the stuff to work. You need to appreciate the nuanced application of a little turn of a screw to make sure that there's no aberration in a gun column for a scanning electron microscope, for instance. And that's only something that you can do if you're hands-on and you talk to engineers and you expose yourself to that. And then I do see a little bit of entitlement, which is not justified from graduates. It's not going to be as easy. And some of those job figures that I showed you, or mineralogists by country and all that stuff, it's definitely not going to be easy for you to get a cushy mineralogist job after you graduate. There are probably only 4 major places that you can get a pretty decent job, excuse me, as a mineralogist. So what you instead need to do is, if you exercise your initiative and you exercise your intellect and you exercise your independence, and you finally get that experience and you build up your CV, then eventually you'll be able to earn the entitlement that you feel you perhaps are entitled to. But it's not a given. When you graduate, please don't feel entitled and think that you're going to get the best job out there. That is something that you need to work towards. And once again, presented it as a ternary diagram because all geologists love ternary diagrams. So just a couple of conclusions. Unfortunately, we're still feeling some of the knock-on effects from the 2008 economic crash or the housing crisis. And I know of mineralogists who lost their jobs in 2017. And the funny thing is, a lot of them changed occupations entirely. So one of them became a psychologist. One of them went into drapes. Another one went into managing a clothing store. What you need to do as a mineralogist is, once again, don't be obsessed with yourself as a mineralogist, or don't be obsessed with your form. Think about your substance. Think about how you can apply your knowledge to do different things. And then you'll find that you'll probably still stay in mineralogy. Things were picking up in the rest of the world before COVID struck. South Africa is still a very interesting case in point with regards to minerals legislation and the lack of, lateral application of the skills that you have as a mineralogist. So we need to break that mindset. We need to think that I don't have to just work for a major mining house. I can find an environmental place or a metallographic place. You need to think along those lines. So yes, a mineralogist is more than just a mineralogist. You need to think substance rather than form. Forget about what you are. Think about what you can do and manage that. You may already know more about analytical equipment than you think. Chances are that's very good. So choose your poison, pick an instrument, and get as much exposure to it as possible. If you have an honors project and it has to do with some kind of analytical stuff, don't just give it to sample prep and forget about it. Stand with the sample preparation technician, watch how they prep the samples. Don't just give it to the person on the TEMA instrument and say, please measure my stuff, and then, go have lunch. Sit there, look at how he or she measures that sample and really get to understand it, because that is stuff that you can put on your CV. Once again, you might be able to leverage your skill to acquire instrumentation exactly because things are bad. You could approach a company that manufactures these instruments. Obviously, the economics is not great, so they won't be justified in hiring someone, but they still need to get their marketing out there. So if you can leverage your skill set to gain access to that instrument and convince them that they'll get something out of it in terms of, free marketing, you might actually be able to make an entrepreneurial thing work. And I have seen this done. It is possible to apply one's analytical skills to more than just minerals, metals, anything that's processed. If it's solid, you can do that. Learn some programming. It might take some time and sacrifice, but I definitely see that that's going to be the way it's going to go. And then manufacture your experience and then market it. Manipulate your situations. Go to conferences, do lunchtime talks, and then you should be able to do it. Okay, thank you very much for that. I know it was a lot to take in, but everything was important to me as far as I'm concerned. So really sorry about going that much overtime.
Thank you, Igor, for that talk. It was very informative. I think we can go straight into questions and give everybody the opportunity to ask your question if they have. I'm just going to ask if you could please put up your hands, and then you can ask your question, or we can also deal with some of the questions that we got before the talk. And so I think you did touch on this in the beginning of your talk, and you said, but somebody wants to know what is the difference between a geologist and a mineralogist, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about that from your own personal experience.
It's actually very, very nuanced. The major thing that I would say is that I don't know if I should tell a story like that, but the nuanced difference, okay? Let's put it a different way. Mineralogists tend to be office geologists. So you can describe a mineralogist as an office geologist. It's somebody who will typically work in a major center like Pretoria, Johannesburg, whatever. And of course, industrial geologists, or at least geologists who are exposed to industry, will then go typically to mine sites. And I know that the paradigm's changing slightly. I know that a lot of geologists want to still be geologists but work in Pretoria and Johannesburg. the only way they can do that really is, you know, as an economic geologist or possibly as a university researcher. That is one way in which you can still, let's say, maintain your geological integrity, but still work in a city, and that's to become a mineralogist. So not bundu bashing, not exploration geology, not all that other stuff. I mean, of course, there are exceptions. So an economic geologist will be an office geologist and all that jazz. But that's the one fundamental difference. The other fundamental difference is your tools. You know, simplistically speaking, I know it's an oversimplification, but your major tool as a geologist is a geological pick. Your major tool as a mineralogist is a microscope in any number of forms. And that's where it gets interesting. And that's where a mineralogist really has to know something about the physics of those instruments. It looks like there are a lot of questions, so I don't want to go too long on the answers. But there's nothing to say that you can't, as a mineralogist, know a lot about geology and vice versa. This isn't dichotomous. And I think it could actually be very dangerous. And that's probably, that could answer quite a few things that have gone wrong in the studies or whatever. But there's subtle distinctions, which is also part of the reason why I always keep that first slide in, right? Wine versus beer, that's not a very great distinction between mineralogists and geologists, but it is something subtle. And because the mineralogist always works in the office, okay, he or she can wear a tie more often. The geologist out there in the field, okay, you need proper boots, all that kind of jazz. So it's subtle. It's not great.
Okay. So what sorts of projects have you worked on in the past?
Right. Things breaking up a little bit. Sorry, try that again.
Hello? Not sure
Hello?
if you can hear me. Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So the question was, what sorts of projects do you work on, and who from industry do you work alongside?
I can tell you who I've worked for. The list of stuff I've worked on is too long to talk about, but maybe, okay. Sure. I think the first part of that question, the easiest way to do it is to basically quickly go through how I got into this. After graduating from university, I went to work for Intellection in Australia, Brisbane, who were the manufacturers of QEMSCAN instruments. And they did a bit of consulting on the side. So typically there, I did a lot of heavy mineral sands analysis. And eventually I started, this is where all of those, going around the world, training people came into it. Intellection would do the analysis, but they'd also sell the instruments, and the instruments would then need to be taught to the people who they sold the instruments to. So that was for 3 years. Came back here then in 2009, worked 4 years for Anglo-American Research. Obviously, that entailed mostly working on platinum group elements. Once again, there I was operating the QEMSCAN mostly. And just to put things in perspective, and this is why it is so interesting. South Africa has the second most automated scanning electron microscopes in the world, and that's directly because of the mining. A lot of these instruments are used in the mining industry, and Anglo-American had 28 in a single room. And if we're looking at 10 to 14 million rand, that's a good 250 million rand in a single room. So there was that. I did a lot of iron ore work for Kumba while I was at Anglo Research, and those were the two major ones there. Then after that, I decided to go my own way, and I actually tried to do a little bit of consulting. So I approached Zeiss, and that's where that whole idea of this that SV model which I've based on somebody else. That's where I started trying to apply it. So I was doing all of the above. I was giving customer demos, writing white papers, writing application notes, teaching the machine to recognize minerals, because this was a new competitor coming on the market, and they needed somebody to be able to get this machine going. So I did that, and in return for doing that, I was doing my own consulting. So then I was analyzing drill core from Kumba, a whole bunch of stuff, and also, and this is something that people don't appreciate as well, also just mineral specimens that come off the street from some amateur gem and mineral collector. So validating, whether your ruby is in fact a ruby. So I was doing a whole bunch of that as well. And then I started a strategic partnership with a lab in Cape Town. We were in the process of getting a micro XRF machine going, and that's where I did all of that engineering geology test work and the environmental geology test work, and once again, heavy mineral sands, you name it, like filter masks, all of that stuff. That's what I did there. And then eventually experienced a bit of burnout and decided that, wait a second, this is too stressful. Let's go back to university and get a couple more letters behind my name. Okay, so that was the first part of the question. The second part of the question?
It was, what are the typical industry professionals that you work alongside?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I mean that it would have been those guys basically. And well, it's funny as well. I also do quite a bit of work. So I still do a lot of work for amateur gem and mineral collectors, and I have a relationship with someone who runs an XRD instrument. So typically what happens is if that person needs SEM work done on those samples, then I'll do the SEM work or the scanning electron microscopy work. But right now I'm actually really trying to focus on the postgrad stuff.
Okay, thanks. I have one follow-up question, and then I'm going to ask Sarah if she has any other questions there. So I think the burning question is, how do you manage or prioritize your time being a lecturer, a postgraduate student, and the president of MINSA and all of these other things that you may be doing?
Yes, very badly. It's difficult. So thankfully, I only lecture for the first semester. So I try to focus, and because I'm registered part-time for the postgrad stuff, what I've been trying to do is focus first semester on the teaching, second semester on the postgrad stuff, and then everything in between is MINSA. But I've thankfully got a great team, a great committee that's been backing me up quite a bit for that. So that's made things easier. To be fair, it helps that this is the third time that I'm chair, but also what helps is, of course, the fact that we couldn't do all these activities, unfortunately, because of COVID, which is, it's disappointing, but we were using it so that we can hit the ground running once COVID is over. So in that sense, it was a little bit quieter this year for MINSA, but that's not to say that we haven't got things going. And I think this Bridge the Gap is a testimony to what we're trying to achieve as well. And we hope we can help you guys get better with what it is that you're doing as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, do you have any questions that you'd like to just ask Igor quickly?
Yeah, there's some that's come up in the chat. So Mtoko has asked, what are some of the best sample prep methods for viewing porous silicate structures in thin sections? I know silicate carbide inhibits to some extent the ability to view some micro / nano structures. Don't know if you have experience with that, Igor. I know I don't.
Yeah, that sounds like a question where we probably, Mtoko, we're probably going to have to talk about that over a 2-hour lunch, because I've never heard of anything like that before in my life. I mean, my question to you is that okay, is that silica carbide coming from the abrasive agents that you're using to polish whatever it is that you're looking at? Because I don't know what it is that you're looking at. So you might want to actually tell me the commodity or the ore or the whatever. And I need to know if this silica carbide is actually a part of that, or is that coming from the grinding agent that you're using to prepare that sample? Yeah, I need more information.
Okay, we'll see if Toko wants to add anything in the chat. Otherwise, I'm sure people can reach out in other forums. Okay, she says they say they'll email you personally, so we'll be able to get some discussion going there. Nebuchadnezzar has asked, what are some of the challenges that you faced as a mineralogist in South Africa?
Yeah, I guess the biggest challenge was trying to get my own consultancy up and running based on that SV model. There was, you have so many angles and fingers in the pie there. It's really difficult. And obviously, probably not a single one of us in this chat room can afford a 14 million Rand scanning electron microscope. So, you have to rely on a bit of luck there and a bit of negotiating skills. And because there are only really, and I'm just referring to the automated scanning electron microscopes, but because they're now, I think, there are only 6 or 7 manufacturers of these instruments, but because these instruments are so expensive, they're not going to have demo versions of these instruments on every factory floor in every country in the world. So I was lucky to have exposure to a mineralogic instrument in Johannesburg, Randburg with Zeiss. But the second they wanted that instrument as a demo instrument in some other country, it was shipped off. So that model then fails there, because now you don't have an instrument that you can analyze anything on. So that's something to be aware of, and that was really difficult. Yeah, and that was honestly, doing all this stuff by myself was the hardest. The easiest was actually working for some of the major mining houses, which is peculiar. I know it sounds weird to say, but if you can get yourself in, great. Can be, it's got a whole bunch of perks. Excuse me, but you are also opening yourself to retrenchments. And when I resigned from that mining house, it was only a year and a half later that they retrenched 80% of their employees. So, this is you have to look at your own personal values. Do you want to struggle the rest of your life and yet still be independent? So at least, you got something going on there, or do you take the perks, but appreciate that you could lose them at the drop of a hat? That's always been a very, very difficult toss up. And there are things that I would have done differently. And maybe I can just mention this now as well. It's been very difficult trying to do the postgrad stuff whilst I'm still trying to consult on the side and everything like that. I think the people who are going to go into mineralogy need to make a decision right at the beginning whether they're going to go into university research or whether they're going to go into industry. But they need to appreciate a couple of things. They need to appreciate that a lot of universities, or at least for a lot of universities, certainly Pretoria is one of them, they incentivize this idea of the perpetual student because they only pay you according to your qualifications. So, if you go out into industry to get that great experience, to work hard, to get the money, whatever, and then you decide to come back to varsity, you're going to have problems, financial problems. So that's something to bear in mind. A much better way of doing it and approaching it would be to just off the bat, when you have those interviews with those mining houses or whatever, ask them if they're willing to pay for your postgraduate studies while you work for them, and you know, get them to do that, and then get that stuff out of the way while you're busy working for these mining houses. And then after that, if you choose to go back to university and to research, then you will really be giving your students applicable knowledge, which I think counts for so much. It means so much. But you need to be aware of that, right? And of course, if you go straight to doctorate, it might be difficult for you to get into industry if that's something that you want to do. So you need to play the game very carefully. You need to balance that juggling quite succinctly for you to get there. None of this is easy. None of this is easy, I'm telling you.
Yeah, thanks, Igor. I don't know, Visha, should I read the last question in the chat, or do you have others from earlier that you want to ask?
You can go.
Okay. So Marilee had asked, what is the sorry, lost my place. What is the best route to take if you are still in high school and you would like to become a mineralogist? Which university offers the best mineralogy curriculum? I suppose that can also be applicable to undergrads a little bit, so maybe not just high school, because I think the subjects will be similar, like with physics and chemistry and that kind of, I'm assuming as well.
Yeah. Look, I honestly think we're at the stage where, and this is where the students are going to have to start differentiating themselves. For the most part, and of course there are exceptions, but for the most part, you know, a honors geology degree from UJ, from WITS, from Tux, from UFS, from Cape Town, you know, they all get you to more or less the same place. I honestly think so. That is not what's going to differentiate you as a mineralogist after after the fact. You're going to have to pick and choose complementary disciplines to differentiate yourself to then finally get those jobs. So for instance, Anglo-American might be looking for operators for their QEMSCANs and their MLAs. They might pull together a whole bunch of honors graduates in geology from wherever, UJ, UP, but UCT, doesn't really matter. The person in that pool who can show Anglo-American that they've done a little bit of programming on the side, for instance, that is going to allow them to manipulate and extract data more easily from those QEMSCANs and those MLAs than anybody else who got those honors degrees. That is going to be the person who's going to differentiate themselves. So if you are coming at this from a high school level, you know, I'd already start doing, honestly, some and make no mistake, I'm not just talking about programming. There are lots of other ways you can mix and match to make your degree more valid. So for instance, if you do a little bit of metallurgy on an online course, for instance, even, or, you know, that might endear you more to any one of these corporations, especially if it's a mining corporation. Then they know they have a mineralogist who can talk metallurgist speak, and that's going to make a difference. So it's going to be this chopping and changing and deciding on this focused path that's going to differentiate you from all the other geologists. It won't be the degree itself. Of course, postgrad, then you start specializing and you can tailor that even more. But on an undergrad level, I honestly think it's mostly the same from what I've seen.
Good to know. And I think a lot of it you pick up along the way. I mean, my sort of physics knowledge when it comes to instrumentation, I learned on the go. So I think some of
absolutely. I knew nothing about physics I knew nothing about physics until I had to start manipulating those scanning electron microscopes. You will pick it up on the way. It's just, you know, getting to that point. And look, you know, it's different times. When I was studying geology, there was 6 of us. That's no longer the case. And we need to branch out and think about how we can apply this mineralogy differently, because things are tough out there. They're a little bit tricky. So people need to, and I apologize for being brutally honest, but I do feel as if somebody needs to be brutally honest with regards to some of these opportunities.
Patricia, I'll
Honesty is
hand
the
back to
best
you for.
policy. Thanks, Sarah. I think we just have one last question, and that is, what opportunities are available for mineralogists outside of South Africa?
So, you know, it's basically, it is basically that slide, right? Where you're looking at all of these different microscopists. So any kind of microscopy field will be applicable to mineralogists. And in fact, the mineralogists will do better in those kind of fields, because they've prepped all those samples and everything. And when I say microscopist, I mean it in the broadest sense of the word. If you've only, okay, I mean, you might want to up the ante a little bit and try and get exposure, excuse me, to a scanning electron microscope, which WITS has. They've got the TEMA instrument and everything. But as soon as you've got exposure to that, don't prevent yourself from applying for a transmission electron microscope job. Don't prevent yourself from applying for a TOF SIMS or a SIMS or anything like that. So definitely do that kind of stuff. The environmental work, it seems to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm sure with our current paradigm, it's going to get even bigger. So any of that stuff, for sure, like there are opportunities out there, apply for those. The one thing that you have to be aware of, though, is that chances are those foreign companies will not employ you unless you're at the level of PhD. So you're going to have to get that stuff sorted. They will not employ that. And once again, it's one of those weird issues. Doesn't matter how much experience you have. You might have operated a TEM for 14 years. Without the PhD, to get overseas is going to be a problem. You know, there are visa issues and all of that. Yeah, but I've certainly, the other way in which you can approach it is, of course, getting into either the mining houses or the analytical laboratories, and then jumping ship to the same, and or the, you know, a sister, what's the term, an offshoot in one of those other countries that you're aiming for. Excuse me. So for instance, you know, biggest analytical laboratory basically in the world is SGS, right? We have SGS analytical facilities in South Africa. That's where some of the mineralogists go. So if you're making a play for Canada, Chile, work for our SGS and then see if you can, you know, play the game and work your way up there, whatever. You know, this is nuanced. You got to play the game carefully without stepping on people's toes and you know, cheesing them off. But the other thing that I would say is that you need to appreciate that these multinational mega corporations are not human beings. They might have value statements on their, you know, on their logo and their motto and everything like that. But you're not working for another human being. You're working for a multinational corporation that's about profit. So maybe you should take care of yourself first before you start, you know, worrying about being too loyal to something that is inanimate. I try to be really politically correct there, but yeah, that's how I see it. And remember that these multinational corporations, if they need to retrench, they'll retrench. So how you go about building that buffer is entirely up to you.
Okay, thank you. A couple of comments in the chat box saying thank you for being honest. So yes, I think it's all people don't really hear honesty coming from professionals in their talk. So thanks for being brutally honest and letting us really know what's happening in industry and how we can go about finding the best career path. I'm not sure if anybody else has any questions or comments. For Igor, thank you very much for your insight. We really do appreciate the time that you've taken today.
Yeah, no, you're more than welcome. Sorry, I went over the time. 20 minutes is way too short for everything that I wanted to say, but I promise you we'll try and get the next talk down to 20 minutes. And yeah, if you are going to post this on YouTube, feel free to take out some of the, I don't want to step on anybody's toes as well with some of my brutally honest stuff. So yeah, maybe just sift through that with a fine-tooth comb to make sure, anyway, that's, oh, okay.
I mean, I think it's important to be honest to our students so that we know that we're making the right choices, because you have to think,
for sure.
And
it's, yeah, it's not going to come from very many people in industry, that's for sure.
Not. Definitely. Okay, well, thank you very much. And I just wanted to ask if anybody has any questions, can they send you an email?
Oh, yes, gladly. No, gladly. It looks like I've already got an email coming in. Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm more than happy to assist, more than happy to help. I consider this an obligation. And a duty, and it's actually quite often more fun than a lot of the other boring stuff that I do. So by all means, contact me. It's not a problem. And you can get me on LinkedIn. I think that's an easy way to find me as well. More than welcome to help.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bhavisha.
We're looking forward to any future talks that we will do with MINSA.
We've already got one lined up, and I think I've got a second one lined up. So, okay. And that's where the SV model is going to come into play.
Okay, we'll talk about it. And thank you to everyone for attending. And just be on the lookout for further information regarding future talks. Have a good evening.
Lekker.